What I want to do is talk to you about a project that's going on in the context of something called Healthy Brains for Healthy Lives, and that I'm sort of responsible for steering in some way. And this is the overarching chunk of that work. It's going to be broken into many pieces I'll tell you about, but this is sort of the overarching set of issues. And so I'll say a few words first about what Healthy Brains for Healthy Lives is, and then I'll talk very briefly. Again, nobody here needs to be told how important social determinants of health are, but I'll just sort of illustrate quickly why those are so compelling when you look at any kind of health question. And then raise questions, and this is where I hope all of you can speak to this, about what is the place of social determinants of health in current neuroscience research, and what should be the place, and what can we do if the way social determinants of health are currently engaged with in neuroscience research is not sufficient for the purposes that we might, wish it to serve. What can be done to improve that? And then, in particular, and this is what this project is about, can we help to develop a framework, the Canadian Framework for Brain Health, or at least part of that, that would help neuroscience researchers and people in policy and practice milieus making use of neuroscience research. And that means clinicians, it means educators, it means all kinds of people in all different walks of life, social service providers, and so on. Can we help them both to influence neuroscience research so that it's pertinent to their needs, and to make use of or interpret neuroscience research in ways that are meaningful and that are prudent and realistic, and so on? Because, as you all know, in the research area, there's a constant cycle of people overselling their research to get grants, basically. So every proposal is about how this is going to solve some pressing problem in the world tomorrow. And the reality is, even if it's great research, it's probably one small link in a very long chain that may take years or decades or forever to kind of build. So there's a tension between that economy and the politics of grantsmanship and all that other stuff, and knowledge production and the influence of science and knowledge on policy and practice in different domains. We would all like to have a firm footing for what we're doing, but there's often a big gap between what we know, or what's on offer, and what we need to know. So that's where this project situates itself, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. So Healthy Brains for Healthy Lives, you can see the URL for the website up there. This is a very large grant to McGill from the Canada First Research Excellence Foundation to do a program of research in neuroscience that will address important health problems and other social issues. So it's a very grand 7-year project. We're more than halfway through it, and it has many goals. Here's a kind of a description again from the website that this is going to improve the health of Canadians by understanding the brain, and there'll be all this innovation. It will have impact on the Canadian economy, on our productivity, on every aspect. And when I say that grantsmanship involves sort of overselling things, this is certainly an example of skillful promotion of a set of projects, whole lines of research that are, potentially impactful in society. The program is divided into 4 broad axes. The central one, the one that's meant to be a sort of cross-cutting theme, is on neuroinformatics and computational modeling. So this is using large data, big data, and using our artificial intelligence, machine learning, and other techniques, both to handle that data, to look for patterns and relationships, and to be able potentially to deliver the results of that kind of analysis to people in ways that allow them to make use of it. So there's both using that kind of research to understand mechanisms, and using that kind of research to provide, for example, a characterization of patients to a clinician that might go deeper than what they're able to get just from asking a limited number of questions. I mean, these are different areas of work in artificial intelligence and so on in medicine. So that's one of the axes, but there are 3 other axes that really have their own methodologies, their own questions, and may or may not make close ties to the neuroinformatics, kind of what's called NeuroHub in the case of HBHL. And one of those axes is on understanding the mechanisms of neurodegeneration, so illnesses that cause changes in the brain that impair brain functioning. So this is really often understanding genetic and molecular mechanisms that underlie things like Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's disease or other things. And some people believe that some psychiatric disorders can be at least partly understood in those terms. So that's the kind of work that's going on. A lot of that work is on a cellular and molecular level. Some of it's at animal levels. A smaller amount of it is in human levels. There is a brain bank at the Douglas Hospital. There are different ways of doing some of that research, if not with human beings, with human tissue. And so one of their projects are making little organoids, little clusters of cells, little models of parts of neural tissue that they can study and culture and so on. Third axis is around cognitive neuroscience and brain plasticity. And this is looking at the fact that the brain is constantly remodeling itself in response to learning and challenges in the environment. That's a very big feature of the brain, and understanding that is extremely important for both the course of illness, including neurodegenerative illnesses, but other things, stress-related problems, all kinds of issues, and maybe leads to new therapeutics and so on. And then the final axis is called population neuroscience and brain health. And this is a very broad rubric under which a number of things have been put, things that can be studied at the level of whole populations, things that have to do with well-being, and things that have to do with clinical services and so on. So it's very heterogeneous. In fact, originally that axis had 3 co-leaders, and because it was covering so much terrain. So I won't go into it too much because the actual divisions here are a little bit arbitrary. They reflect the different principal investigators in this very large program, which in a sense has become an internal granting agency funding different projects at McGill by many, many people. There are dozens, if not hundreds of people being funded in one way or another from this grant program. There are other partners. The main partners are Western University, which has another grant from the Canada First Research Excellence Foundation for Brain Research, also the University of Montreal, and various other international partners and so on. So that's the big picture. And in the original grant, there was a statement that social science would play an important role, and in particular because the idea is to have an impact on society. And one of the forms that this is supposed to take, as per the original proposal, is the development of something that was called a Canadian Framework for Brain Health. So that sounds grand. It was not very specified in any detail in the proposal, but is meant somehow to be guiding research that's relevant to promoting brain health, which itself is kind of a metaphor that just throws 2 words together, and there's plenty that can be done to unpack that. One of the pieces of work that M did was collect all kinds of definitions of brain health, explicit or implicit, around different places. And what comes out of that is that there's no one definition, and one can end up with a very broad definition. And since most of us think that all our complex experience and thinking and behavior is mediated by the brain, it's hard to think about what aspect of health is not brain health in some sense, either caused or in consequence. But in any event, that's a term we're working with. A lot of these things are open-ended, and it's for us to define a piece of work or a useful set of tools or ideas that can be done under that umbrella. So that's the overall context of this work, and I'm chairing that framework for brain health, which unfortunately is starting very late in the process. Many of us pushed hard to have this done early on, and there was a decision that they would wait until some of the different lines of research were bearing fruit in different ways, and then see how that could feed into this process. Just again, to give you a little bit more context, I won't belabor this right now. This is hot off the press. This is some word smithing and sort of visioning by Leslie Fellows and Madeline Sharp and Anna Weinberg, basically articulating what this framework could be in spirit. We have a lot of other details about, I'll talk about in a moment, some of them about what it could be, but this is very much the notion that we're focusing on the idea of brain health as a health equity issue for people in Canadian society, that we want to be able to improve the health and quality of life of people, and to use whatever we're learning from neuroscience, in ways that are effective for that. But that clearly has to be a two-way street, so that the neuroscience that's being done is driven, at least in part, by what these health and social priorities are. And again, this is all stuff that will be developed in more detail as we go along in a kind of recursive process. As you hear by the end of this presentation, part of the mechanisms that we're setting up for this piece of work is a kind of stakeholder engagement process in which many different groups and potential knowledge users and knowledge producers can be in conversation with each other, so that the final form this takes reflects set some sense of collective priorities that are more representative. Because frankly, I mean, having a project that's mainly at McGill and Western and whoever else comes on board and calling it the Canadian anything is already a bit of a problem. So we hope that we can start something and then have a much wider conversation, and so there can be broad investment in this, even though we don't have the resources of something like the Mental Health Commission of Canada, whatever, to do this. Here's some principles that I think, again, comes out of this work just very recently from Leslie Fellows and others. Leslie, I should say, is a neurologist, a neuroscientist, cognitive neuroscientist, and one of the key investigators in Healthy Brains for Healthy Lives. So you can see here that these are all framed around issues of equity, but also of voice, and the idea that there, as we'll discuss, there is a kind of gap between what is typically studied in neuroscience, partly because it's a very interesting scientific question, and partly because we have the tools to tackle it. I mean, the way science works is kind of like coal mining. You get to a certain place and you have certain things that are exposed at that moment, and you have certain tools, so that's where you work. It may not be where the most interesting question is, it just happens to be the place where you can actually do some useful work. So this is a perennial problem in research, where we study what we have the tools for and what's currently hot in the field, and there may be a varying degrees of gap between that and the questions that a clinician has, or an educator, or some other person trying to apply neuroscience. So that's another part of the knowledge translation gap. So anyway, these are some of the broad goals that lie behind this, that in a way our discussion is supposed to speak to. And in our attempts to articulate, okay, so what would this framework look like? We're sort of, we've been given, just like we've been given brain health as a metaphor, we've been given the idea that we're supposed to be producing a framework. So that's another piece of work and big debate we've had. What do we mean by a framework? And there are, again, many definitions out there. We're interested partly in a conceptual framework, but in bringing it down from the level of principles that I've just laid out, or conceptual models, bringing it down to the level of actual tools and schemes that people can use in different modes. And we're now talking about two ways that they can be used. Tools that can be used by researchers. So by neuroscience researchers or other people working in health or other field who want to do work that may incorporate or respond to or be more useful in addressing social determinants or social contexts of the real world. So that's thinking about the issues I'm going to raise from the point of view of, okay, how would we take this recognition that context matters, and that poverty is a very powerful determinant of people's health and well-being, and how would we think about it and develop and use certain measures or certain ways of tracking it that could be incorporated into research that is either designed specifically to address that, or in many cases, we're talking about big data neuroscience. Often people just collect enormous amounts of data, perhaps around some subset of questions, but with the possibility and the recognition that that same very large data set could be used for many things in the future that nobody's quite even anticipated yet. So because it's a big investment to start collecting that stuff. And I should say that the Neuro Hub, one of the central pieces in Healthy Brains for Healthy Lives, is based on this idea of a database that allows people to work with thousands of brain images and of biosamples and of psychological tests and all kinds of things. And what's more, to make it available in an open science way. So it means that for example, one of the things that's accessible through NeuroHub is the UK biobank studies. So it's possible, if you have a research question and the data that was collected allows you to address that, there's some variables there you could work with, you can actually go and do secondary data analysis and discover interesting things. And people are doing that kind of research, among many other things, within this Healthy Brains for Healthy Lives. So what that raises, though, is, of course, if you didn't ask the questions when you collected the data, when you do a brain scan, it's common to ask people, are you left-handed or right-handed? It used to be very standard whenever you did, perfusion tests and so on, because there's a big asymmetry in the brain, and it's important to know. But people are not always asked, what's your income, or where do you live, or other things that might be very powerful links to a whole host of different social determinants. So one concrete question is, can we help to provide a toolkit and a framework so that going forward, data can be collected that will be able in the future maybe to answer some questions that are not even being looked at the moment. There are many other things that can be done, and we'll come to that in a moment. So that's this first kind of framework. In a way, we've separated these into two separate but related pieces of work, and that's developing a kind of framework, a toolkit, an approach for people who are interested in doing or already doing neuroscience research, so they can better consider social determinants of health that they are interested in, or have been alerted to, or told they should be paying attention to, or whatever. The second part, in a way, is sort of moving in the other direction. If that first part, it needs to be informed very much by the experience of people in the real world, whether that's people living with health problems or people living with social inequities, or it's clinicians saying, I need certain kinds of information to be able to work with my patients. If that's sort of the knowledge users, if you will, informing research, telling researchers this is what we need to know. There's also the opposite end, where researchers are saying, okay, we found something really interesting and we think everybody needs to know this. We think that doctors should change the way that they practice and so on. That's certainly the promise that's often made in this research. As those of you who are clinicians know, particularly in psychiatry, the promises often far exceed the reality. We've been told for many years now that we have a new age of therapeutics in psychiatry that's going to be precise and so on, and that's pretty far from the reality, which in all honesty has not changed dramatically over the course of my career. So, we have small refinements rather than radical changes in most areas. There are probably a few exceptions. In any event, the idea is, can we promote a kind of knowledge translation process that speaks in a language and in a way and with attention to what the real needs are and the real concerns of the knowledge that's being produced. So it's not simply promoting a new idea in the way that we get it in the newspaper, and when people get interviewed by their own hospital research institutes, they want to know, what's your latest breakthrough, so that we can, try to get a newspaper article on some flashy thing that happened. And that's very different than talking about practically about what do we have, what do we know that's going to change how we practice. So that's a second kind of framework in a way. They're closely related because they both involve any kind of knowledge exchange as a conversation between people. I prefer the metaphor of knowledge exchange rather than knowledge translation or knowledge mobilization, because those tend to be asymmetrical ways of talking about it. And ideally, what's happening is people are talking together and finding common ground, finding the fit, rethinking things that the other person or the other perspective is encouraging them to do. So ideally, things should be moving between these two, but the agendas are somewhat different, and maybe they deal with different kinds of, or different stages in the development of new knowledge and the application of knowledge. So the one I'm going to be talking about then today is mainly this first task. Even though it's related to the second task. And we'll have another meeting later on. We have a process that we're developing for stakeholder engagement. I'll talk about that at the very end, and we'll come back at different points. And people like Melissa and others of you here are very heavily involved with this other level of seeing it from the point of view of the community and what they need and what can be offered in terms of what might be out there. For example, the Mental Health Commission of Canada promoted the idea of recovery as a model. And the question is, what's the actual content in that, and how can that be brought to people in a way that would change everyday practice, let's say, in mental health. So that's that second dimension of this work that, as I say, I won't be emphasizing too much. Okay, so let's say a few words about the broad conceptual challenge or issue, and I'll start with this sort of version of a diagram that I recall seeing at some point in medical school, in like the first week of medical school or something, and it sort of underlies what in medicine is talked about as the biopsychosocial approach. The idea that the human world and biology, in fact, presents us with very complex systems that are hierarchically structured, in the sense that human beings are made up of stuff. and that stuff is arranged in very specific ways. And the stuff that is arranged is itself made up of other stuff, which is arranged in very different. So human beings have a brain. The brain is made up of circuits. The circuits are made up of neurons. The neurons are made up of different parts of a neuron. Those are made up of molecules, and you can go all the way down. So that's a feature of biology. It's a special feature of biology that makes biology something more than physics and more than chemistry, because of all that arranging and structuring. And it requires different theories, different models, because when you arrange things in a new system, they have new dynamics. And the interesting point of this diagram, though, is that that first part of that, those layers of sort of that go up to the brain don't stop at the level of the brain or at the level of the person. They keep going. So human beings are social beings, and our everyday functioning depends on other people. So we think with and through other people. And if you want to characterize somebody's development and their functioning and their problems, you actually have to include that in your picture. And just as the brain, let's say, has many levels of structure, the social world actually has many levels of structure. Whether you think of it geographically, like, you have a household, and then you have a neighborhood, and then you have a community, and then you have a society, and then you have international networks. So you can think of it that way. You can think of it on different time scales. You can think of it in different ways. In other words, as having these layers of structure. So that's sort of just the reality, sort of the factual world that we're all encountering all the time, and that we're trying to find languages to describe and to understand, and theories to figure out what's going on to characterize problems. So you can see right away one of the interesting challenges this posed, which is on this picture, neuroscience is only part, and the brain and all that is only part of a very wide sweep of structures that human beings are embedded in and made up of, and that are important to us. And in a sense, when we talk about social determinants of health, we're sort of saying, let's look beyond the person out into the world and ask how that works. And I stress this because sometimes people think in a very dichotomous way, this is part of the legacy of the mind-body problem or whatever, that the brain is machinery and it's very concrete and we can study mechanisms, but the social world is, I don't know what, it's something else. And I feel very strongly the social world is also material. It's also people, and it's people building structures and doing physical things with each other, and doing things through words that have physical consequences to each other. And those can be just as causal as something going wrong at a synapse. Something going wrong in a marital couple can be just as much a cause of a health problem as something going wrong at the level of a synapse. So that's a basic sort of conceptual issue that the biopsychosocial approach tried to argue, and I think is true. I think it comes out, it's just good biology, it's just systems biology, but it poses a problem when you think that there's something very special about the brain, just like some people think there's something very special about molecules. And there's a journal called Molecular Psychiatry, as though somehow you can study the fundamental issues of psychiatry, you can study at the level of molecules. And again, I don't deny knowing about molecules is very important, but so is knowing about cells and circuits and brains and people and stories and interactions and so on. So this is the problem we're facing, and Joel and I have written about this, and I've written about this in other contexts. So this is what this article tries to talk about, is this question of, so if that's the sort of reality for human experience, what kind of science does psychiatry need, or for that matter, any aspect of health and human behavior, neurology or general healthcare or education? What kind of science is going to inform better educational practice? Suparna Chowdhury, one of our colleagues, has looked at how neuroscience about the adolescent brain is informing people's educational practices. So, and this article uses the framework of, and as did an article that Joel and I wrote, uses the framework of the National Institute of Mental Health in the US, of what they call the research domain criteria, which was an effort to give a framework for promoting productive research in psychiatry that they would use for funding. And it presents this scheme, which basically you can see the columns are some of the levels I talked about. You can see those sort of broad levels of looking at the level of genes and molecules and cells and circuits and so on. And then the rows are different systems. So there's an attachment system, or there's a fear regulation system, or there's a a person recognition system, and so on. Now, these systems are not necessarily, oh, we know now what the building blocks are of the human mind. These are different paradigms, different models that people have developed in the course of research, where they know something about how it works in animals and they can study it. So that's the matrix that then the US NIMH was saying, rather than funding people to research depression, we want to fund people to research these different systems because we think that's closer to what's really going on rather than our diagnostic labels, and we'll be able to understand human problems better from this point of view. So fair enough, that's a reasonable way to do things given the current state of neuroscience knowledge. The problem and the focus of the article I just showed you is that if you look at that hierarchy, you notice right away that it's severely truncated. If you come back to that first diagram I showed you that said, okay, you've got all these biological levels within the person, and then you have all these other levels going beyond the person, that hardly appears here. It's also squished into, there's a column there that says self-report. I mean, that's really, again, just a method. We'll ask people to answer questionnaires. If you ask what's going on when somebody asks a questionnaire, well, that's a very complicated process of their own cognition, of their relationship to the person who's asking the question, of their relationship to society and to the institution where the question is being asked, all kinds of things that require other theories to give a proper account of what's going on. Certainly in terms of how people present in a clinical setting and narrate their symptoms, it's very, very complicated. So that doesn't appear anywhere here. It would appear in this just as, okay, I want to do research on self-report and a certain psychometric problems with self-report, and then you could bring all that stuff on board. But you see that it's not being given anything like the same status as these other dimensions. And the RDoC framework acknowledges in its own workings that there are other dimensions that are not presented here. That is not just these different sort of hierarchical, spatial, and temporal dimensions that are represented by the biological hierarchy. There also is the environment. And they acknowledge that the environment is very complex and we probably need a whole other set of factors or dimensions to characterize the environment. But they did not put the same effort. They put a lot of effort. There were many different work groups and long discussions on how to come up with the scheme, which would then support funding. They didn't put anything like the same effort into articulating the environment part. They somehow assume that'll take care of itself, or we'll get to that later. There's often an assumption that we'll get to that later because these are the fundamental processes, or something like this is going to be the fundamental processes. So once we understand those, we can go back now and ask questions about how does the environment influence that, and so on and so forth. So I'm belaboring this right now because you'll see it's very important for where we're going and what we want to suggest ultimately. The other dimension that's not presented here is a kind of temporal dimension, which has to do with development and the recognition that all biological systems are developmental systems, and understanding that's crucially important. I'm reading an interesting book right now called The Self-Assembling Brain, that basically makes the point that one of the big fallacies in genomics was that genes are a blueprint for the brain, or genes are instructions for the brain, and they're not. They contain what in this book they talk about as algorithmic information. Genes contain information such that if you put them in a cell in a certain context and put energy in and let it evolve over time, it will recursively construct something out of interactions with itself and with the environment. So that's very different information. You can look, we know now from science of, cellular automata and so on, you can have an extremely simple algorithm that can produce an extremely complex structure. In fact, one that is chaotic, that is to say, is quite hard to predict, is deterministic, but the only way you can predict the outcome is by actually running the thing. So the argument is, that is a very different connection between this level of the genes and this final complexity of the brain, which actually is much more complicated than the genome by orders of magnitude. So there's fundamental issues there that are not being addressed by not taking on board the environment and the temporal framework of development in a more serious way. So that's going to become important as we go along. Now, there are different frameworks that are currently used in different ways by different groups of people for thinking about this hierarchical structure that I showed you at the beginning, which is nothing more, again, just to emphasize, that picture of the hierarchical structure is nothing more than a kind of crude picture of the phenomena in front of us, that they have all these different layers or levels or scales, and those are all important. The one that, as I say, many of us are exposed to in medical school in a very crude way is the biopsychosocial approach. So we're simply told, look, there are all these levels. There's biology. There's also psychology, and that approach was developed originally by George Engel, who was an internist and a psychoanalyst, and he was very concerned about how to put psychological theory and psychodynamics together with physiological models. And then this other layer that is called the social. And the idea is somehow all these are important. And if you're a clinician, you have to pay attention to all these things. So maybe your main, if you're a biomedical practitioner, your main specialized knowledge and your skills and maybe most of your interventions are at a biological level. I'm going to write a prescription for something, and I understand its workings mainly in terms of how it affects certain biological processes. But you need to know what the person thinks about their problem, and how they're interpreting what you're saying to them, and what they're worried about, and all these other things to be a good practitioner. And maybe those things that the person is thinking actually affect their physiology. Not maybe, we know they do, and affect their functioning. So maybe that other level is also important. And similarly, you need to know, where does this person live, and do they have enough money to buy their medication, and so on. But it goes beyond that, again, at that very practical level, and this is where we're getting into social determinants of health, to involve actual processes in the social world that are changing the person's brain, changing their functioning, changing their capacity to live with certain challenges they might have, and so on. So that's all implicit in the biopsychosocial approach. But the biopsychosocial approach has also come under quite a bit of attack in recent years, particularly by certain philosophers of psychiatry, because of the claim that it's empty. It's just very broad. It's trivially true, but it doesn't give you any practical way of proceeding. I have to say, I don't agree with that. I think people who say that have had no training in psychology or sociology or anything else that would fill that black box up with lots of ideas and lots of at least partial models of bits and pieces of processes that are relevant. Anybody who's trained in family theory and family therapy has a set of models for how interactions can go wrong and how one can intervene. That's not a comprehensive theory of human social behavior, but it's just like in biology, we don't have very many comprehensive theories. We have piecemeal theories of certain kinds of mechanisms and certain ways things can go wrong. I think, in fact, we have those at every level. So I don't really personally agree at all with the argument that the biopsychosocial approach is just sort of an empty scheme. I think it's a placeholder for a huge amount of detail. The challenge is, it's true, it's not very organized. We don't have a way of saying, okay, here's a way to break it down very systematically. So now you're filling in each of these slots as you assess a person or as you go through it. That's the missing piece that's ongoing work. I've already mentioned now the second column here is RDoC that I just mentioned, and I've listed there not the rows, which are the different domains that they study, but the hierarchical levels, because that's the part that would correspond roughly to the biopsychosocial approach, and you can see the levels that are there. The third column that I have is one way of describing what's going on in a field, not a field really, an approach that's broadly termed omics. And this is really the use of various biological measures to characterize not just individuals, but populations in large numbers. So a lot of this work is related both to the biological technology of being able to measure certain things at particular levels. So you've got, again, the genome, the epigenome, that is the way in which the genes are being turned on and off by various mechanisms. The transcriptome, what's actually getting copied from the genes, so what's active in terms of current transcription of the genome. Proteomics, what is the makeup of the different proteins in a particular tissue or organ. Metabolomics, having to do more with the dynamics of metabolic systems and so on. So you have all these different levels. And part of the interest in this, first of all, is that there are technologies for these, new ways of measuring these, and measuring huge amounts of data, doing an entire gene-wide scan on someone, for example. And this is the kind of stuff that then, because it involves in many cases hundreds or thousands of variables that are being collected, it gets amalgamated across hundreds or thousands of people. And then you have so-called big data that poses huge problems in terms of managing it, in terms of finding the patterns, deciding which patterns really make a difference, what's just noise. You have such large quantities of data that ordinary statistics become useless because all kinds of patterns will appear, but whether they are really meaningful patterns or not requires some other kind of test or some other kind of validation method and so on. So there's both great power, but great technical issues around all this. And all of this gets framed sometimes in terms of what's been called precision medicine, precision psychiatry, and so on, with the idea that if we can get enough data, huge amounts of data, not only from an individual in terms of every gene in your body, not only every gene, we'll do your epigenome, so now we know not just all your genes, but which ones are currently active and which ones have been turned off by virtue of your developmental history or other things. And now we'll have the map. Right now we'll know who you are in some precise way, and we can decide this is the best medication for you and so on. Now, this work that the best examples of this work that are going on are actually in the area of things like cancer genomics and some other areas where people know enough about variations of certain diseases that they can make some distinctions in how they treat people. So, this drug will be better for you, or this treatment will be better for you because you have this particular variety. Superficially, at the level of looking at tissue in the microscope or whatever, it looks the same. But when we get down to this granular level of measuring these certain biological parameters, we know there's a difference here, and we know that therefore the following treatment will be better. So that's the hope of these precision omics kinds of approaches. The final column that you can see here, I've labeled the eco-social or systemic point of view. And this is a point of view that I'm going to be arguing for a little bit again today, that I'm most invested in. And it has several roots. In this area, probably the most recognized root would be in social epidemiology, or the work of Nancy Krieger, who's a social epidemiologist who's looked a lot at social determinants of health. And she's done it from the point of view of talking about embodiment. How does the social world and the environment we're living in get under the skin to affect people in basic ways in their body? That's what she means by embodiment for the most part. And then she also is interested in human behavior, which I put here under the rubric of agency, because it's about what people do. What practices do people have? Do they exercise? Do they eat good food? Do they smoke cigarettes, etc.? All these things which can be understood, I guess, in a very mechanistic way, but we usually like to think of them as involving choices, involving decisions, involving a variety of influences that, to some degree, interact with people's subjectivity and their agency. So we need to consider that in different ways, even if it's often very constrained. You may eat, food that's not very helpful, and you may live in a food desert where the only way to get quick and cheap food is to go to McDonald's and get, something that's full of salt and fat and terrible for you. So then your bad health choices, your bad food choices are not simply your bad decisions. They're you responding to a very powerful set of social circumstances, which are partly geographic, where do you live, and related to poverty and everything else, but go way beyond that, because it also has to do with the marketing of those companies and their deliberate efforts to use everything they can learn from behavioral neuroscience and everything else in terms of how to maximally target you. We're in the middle of this crisis around Facebook right now, which is a good example, again, of how certain human appetites and social proclivities are being exploited by people using the best available research on how to sort of entangle us in our own unhealthy proclivities. Okay, so that's the agency level. And then you have this other level of social structure, the environment, the physical environment, the social, humanly constructed environment, all of its institutions and practices, and the economic system. And that's very important, again, for Nancy Krieger and other people who understand these large-scale structural determinants of health as some of the most powerful and most broadly determinative factors that affect whole segments of the population. So I'm showing you these different schemes partly to point out, first of all, that they're all gesturing in the same direction, but they're very different levels of development of the social in these schemes. And really, the only one that develops the social to any great extent is the eco-social perspective. In omics, recently there's been an effort by some people, Jim Van Os, other people, to begin to articulate what they've called the exposome. And that was also done in toxicology. What are people exposed to in the environment, and can we characterize that? Or the envirome, can we characterize the environment in some kind of multidimensional way that would be analogous to what we're doing at other levels? So the door is open to doing that. The problem, and again, we'll come to this, is it's usually done from the point of view of a particular biological question. So rather than maybe starting from the social level and saying, what do we know about the important dimensions of the social world? And therefore, what do we need to be measuring? It's usually from the point of view of, okay, we have a certain experimental paradigm here or a certain biological parameter that we think is related to certain things in the environment. And so we sort of look at the environment from that point of view. So the question that we'll come to again is, are there other ways to enlarge and expand our understanding of these things and to give us some kind of a framework to work with them? What I'm going to go on to do is tell you a little bit about the approach we're trying to take, show you some different frameworks for social determinants of health, and then basically end with a set of questions about how does this relate to neuroscience and what could neuroscience research add to this if we, beyond just telling us what we already know in a different form, what can it add to sort of change how we're approaching some of these things and vice versa. There's no question that there's enormous need. And again, there's a tension. Part of the tension is that where the need is may not be where the research is going on. In other words, the research looks at other questions, maybe. And then if the research does find something, because the need is great, there may be a tendency to want to take that idea and run with it. So to give you a concrete example, as part of the underlying, some of the research that motivated this grant and so on, Michael Meany and his group at McGill over the years has done really interesting research on the epigenetics of the impact of stress, and showing first with animal models and then some hints that similar things happen with human beings, that when there's stress or when there's insufficient caretaking, this is with rats, mother rats taking care of their rat pups, there are epigenetic changes in the regulation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So a basic physiological system that we think is part of regulating the stress response. When that work was done, and interestingly, those changes can be passed along extragenetically across generations. So that's also extremely interesting that's a whole other kind of set of questions on what's going on there. When that work happened, there were people in the area of indigenous health who became extremely excited by this and said, aha, this explains transgenerational trauma. And so they approached various researchers saying, we want to study this because we think this is related to what's happened in Canada with, residential schools. We just had our National Day of Reconciliation, of taking a moment to think about this history and trying to think about how to address it. And so people were very captivated by this epigenetic level of explanation. But there are many problems with that. And it's a big question. If you latch onto that example, does it affect your practice and how you approach things? And if it does it affect it positively or negatively? For many reasons. First of all, that's not the only thing that's going on. We have no idea how important that actually is. If it is important, it's probably a very small effect related to many other factors. Those epigenetic effects are largely reversible with other experiences. So then the story should just be, okay, what do I do to reverse these? Not that this explains the enduring trauma and so on. So there's a whole set of questions there. So I'm just using this example for the moment. Maybe we'll have another talk someday where we talk about this in more detail. But my point simply is that it's a situation where, because there's a very interesting and fascinating piece of neuroscience research and a very big social problem, the temptation to put the two together and say, aha, now we know something very important, even though maybe we don't know how important it is and we don't know what the implications would actually be, is very strong. And it's very strong on both sides. It's strong on the side of the neuroscientist who'd like to say, I have something useful to offer, and it's a beautiful piece of scientific work. And it's very strong on the side of the practitioner who says, help, I've got a million things to deal with. They're all overwhelming. Give me something to focus on, or give me some way of even conceptualizing this. So there's a push and pull factors there that can lead to dilemmas. So again, I just want to highlight those for the moment. These are the kinds of issues when we're thinking of this framework, we would like not to simply say, oh, epigenetics is important, but here's how to think about something like epigenetics, because tomorrow there may be a lot of new research that's going to change our view anyway, but how should you think about it? How can you integrate it into your other things without sort of being blinded? And Michael Meany actually, as part of an earlier workshop related to this work, we did a workshop with indigenous leaders who were interested in epigenetics, and he presented the work partly to tell them, to put it in perspective, to sort of not not think it's going to answer so many questions for them, because it's actually just one of many complicated things that are going on, unfortunately. The world is still complicated even after we do the research, sometimes more complicated, not less complicated after we do the research. Anyway, we'll come back to that. Many discussions around this, and you've already heard some of my prejudices. I'm expressing them every time I give you an example or kind of whatever. So we've been trying to think about what would be a framework, conceptual framework, for taking the neuroscience seriously, but not putting it in the proper context. So these are the kind of broad ideas that we're now trying to develop in different ways. So the first is to recognize that to understand the neuroscience and to do relevant neuroscience research, to address the kinds of clinical and social questions we're interested in, the work has to be interdisciplinary. We have to have, if you want to characterize the social world, you need to have researchers and scientists who are experts in thinking about the social world and ways of describing it. That's pretty basic. So this idea of interdisciplinarity and finding ways to talk across the different specialized languages and domains and very narrow focuses that tend to happen in science, because that's how you make progress, at kind of the cutting edge. The second part is this eco-social or ecosystemic view that I outlined on the other side, on the earlier slide, which is to recognize that the brain is not just a bunch of circuits that you can study separately. It's also in a body, and the body is in a world, and we have to be characterizing all of that somehow. So we have to think about how can we characterize that. If we want to be studying aspects of the brain and neural functioning and neuropathology and so on that are actually translatable into real world situations, we have to be considering those other levels at some point. So that's what I'm calling here a sort of eco-social systemic view of the brain. The third is that we have to have a developmental perspective, that looking at things at one point in time is going to be perplexing because we don't understand how things got to be that way. If you look at racism, for example, at this moment, you can look at how sensitive somebody is in the laboratory to racial cues, how much they perceive other people in terms of race. And you can show differences in the brain. You can show differences in threat perception, so that people who are perceived as different are experienced or seen as more threatening to other people. These are important clues about social dynamics that we can see operating in other forms. But you can't fully understand that without understanding the history of how these categories were created and how people are socialized into them in different ways. And you won't even know where to look to see where do these things come from, where do these biases come from, and how malleable are they, and when are they acquired, and so on and so forth. So I'm just picking, you could pick absolutely anything. I'm just picking that one little example to emphasize that it all needs a developmental perspective. The third is now this idea that if we accept that things are embedded in the social world, then we have to look at, so which aspects of the social world are most powerfully determinative of the outcomes we're interested in. So that's what we're going to be focusing in on more today. And then another facet of the social world is that it is diverse, that people have different identities, have different social positions. Societies have structures, and we know that those are associated with enormous disparities in health. So that's a clue, first of all, to important social determinants of health. It's also an urgent issue to address in terms of health equity and health of populations. And the final notion that we want to develop in these frameworks, this way of thinking, is how to integrate then the more precision approach, which is supposed to help us be a little more tailored in what we're doing to people, and a more person-centered approach, which considers not only these omics levels that we're measuring, but considers who the person is, what their values are, what their life story is, what their aspirations are, what their predicaments are, all these dimensions. Because when we talk about a person, we don't usually think, the way I think of you is in terms of your genome. I think of you in terms of how you present yourself to me and how you are in relation to other people, and what account you give of yourself. So it's at a very high level of cognitive and social processes that we experience personhood and selfhood. It may have its roots in very basic things in our development and biology, but by the time we come to be a person with a certain kind of suffering and a certain kind of predicament, there's a lot that we have to engage with each other to make sense of that. And a good clinician or a good teacher or good anybody is paying attention to those stories. But if you only study the brain in animal models, you're not going to be studying the impact of stories, individual and collective stories, and on, which, as I say, can be among the most powerful determinants of people's health. So these are right now the sort of broad ideas that we want to drill down into and show how this would change the nature of neuroscience research, what it would look like, what kinds of other work might be done, how existing work could be reinterpreted and applied in certain ways if we take these frameworks into account. But the challenge, of course, is to make it beyond the broad principles and the principles that maybe make sense to those of us who work already at that level. If you're a psychotherapist, you're working a lot with people's stories and you're accustomed to, receiving information in that form and transmitting information in that form and thinking in that way. But if you're working in cell cultures, that may be, even though you have that as an everyday person, it may be a very separate area of your life that you don't put together with your understanding of mechanisms. So a few words then about social determinants of health specifically and the frameworks that are available. This whole approach comes from some very important work in social epidemiology, particularly in the UK, that really showed how differences in economic differences and particularly economic inequality itself within society, also differences in the kinds of jobs and work and control people have over their lives, things like that have enormous impact on health, enormous impact on cardiovascular health, for example, who dies of a heart attack, enormous difference on mortality, morbidity, lifespan, all the most basic things. And that work was so clear and so strong and so advocated for by various people. I've mentioned Michael Marmot here as an important person in that process, that it began to be taken very seriously at a national and international level. And so you have in 2012, just as one very important milestone, the Rio Declaration. We have people here from Brazil, so this is in Rio de Janeiro, basically arguing that given the evidence for how powerful these broad determinants are, healthcare has to move upstream to consider not just the delivery of medicine to people, but the larger social structures that cause ill health. That if you really want a healthy population, and if you really want to even treat disease economically, you should try to go upstream and prevent the basic causes, like by creating more equality in society and so on. This is very appealing, obviously, to many people for political and moral and human rights reasons, totally aside from the science. If anybody who comes up with an argument for why equality is good, is probably other people are going to say, well, we like to hear that. That's music to our ears. Thank you for giving us more evidence. The truth is, we shouldn't be fighting for human rights just because it has positive health effects. There are moral and ethical reasons for saying this is the kind of world we want to live in. So it's one of the dilemmas around this. But in any event, come back down to the health domain, we have these very powerful correlates. And so people have been taking this seriously for some time, the last 20 years or so, and there have been a variety of statements and positions and frameworks that people have been developing, which are oriented oftentimes upstream, as I say, toward the level of policy. And I've got here these sort of rough levels of, when people talk about upstream and downstream, they mean downstream is the most proximal things, what's happening to an individual person in terms of the impacts on them and their health, which might include their own physiology, their own immediate environment. It might include the health services they go to. That's another step, and so on. But that's embedded in a larger social environment. So I mentioned a food desert earlier. Notice you might be prone to diabetes because of and obesity because of your genes. And the way you were brought up in your family, that your family thought every time you were upset, they should give you, a bottle full of fruit juice to suck on when you were a baby, and maybe other things that are bad health practices, and so now you're stuck with this problem. But you may also live in a particular neighborhood where it's actually very hard, very expensive. You may be an indigenous person living up north, where to buy a head of lettuce could cost you $5 to $10 to buy a head of lettuce because everything has to be flowing in. But it's much cheaper to go buy fast food, even in the freezer case, and heat it at home. So these are intermediate level, if you will, structural things. And then you could look at the largest structural issues. What are the government policies? What kind of economic system are we living in? What is concerning on people? So the higher level you go up to, the more it's something that physicians would see as, well, that's way out of my purview. I can't really deal with that directly. That's an issue for policy. That's an issue for economic policy and so on. But all these levels can involve policy. I mean, because there can be decisions made about how do we structure our healthcare system, or how do we improve access for certain groups that are not getting access. That's a policy issue. We could decide let's create a clinic in a certain place. Let's make money available for certain kinds of services. Let's ration out services differently. So that could be a very high level decision that's targeting a more downstream step in the process. One of the interesting questions for us to think about is, to what extent, since you would think offhand that the neuroscience research is inherently located downstream in some ways, that is looking at the point at which different contexts, different environments, different factors affect the physiology and the neurology of a person. In what ways does that more local kind of causal effect have implications for the largest level kind of process? Like if you say, and this has already happened, I mean, we know early child development is terribly important. There's a lot going on in the brain in the first few years of life, and good nutrition at that point is crucially important. Not only good nutrition, but appropriate social care. If you're brought up in an orphanage and you don't get ordinary human contact, you may well have persistent, biologically based deficits in your functioning for the rest of your life. And we know the Romanian orphanage studies and other things that sort of point in that direction. So you could say, well, that has a policy implication for what should early childcare look like. And then if you start saying, how are we going to make sure everybody gets that, you start moving up to larger and larger structures where the decisions have to be made. So that kind of discussion has already gone on in Canada, and we have Clyde Hertzman and other people who really advocated precisely for this kind of thing. And to the extent that Canada has had some successes in Quebec, and notably in other places, in making things like childcare and daycare, good quality daycare, more readily available and so on, it's probably been driven by some of this kind of research and these claims. It's an interesting question. We'll come to it later again. How important is the neuroscience in this? If you just do an epidemiological study and you show a correlation that the absence of certain kinds of care lead to certain outcomes, do you need to know the mechanism? So I'm going to come back to this at the end. And what would knowing the mechanisms in more detail, how might that change our policy? Because you could say a lot of what we know in terms of health recommendations, we know just because of correlations between social parameters and outcomes. And if we know that correlation, maybe we already have a basis for action. We don't have to know all the intermediate, presumably there are all kinds of complicated intermediate steps, and maybe there's some differences along the way. So when we've dealt with the whole situation crudely, maybe we can say, let's do it in a more refined way now and sort out, which people need this and which people need that, because there are some different ways, different paths, let's say. But anyway, I think it's the thing we'll come back to. It's one of the questions that I think is interesting in this area where we get down to the nitty-gritty. Now, there are a lot of different frameworks trying to enumerate what are the salient social determinants of health. And this is one of the tasks that we've set ourselves, is to sort of think these through and decide which of these ways of characterizing them are going to be useful for neuroscience research on the one hand and for policy on the other. I would say most of these things have been driven from the policy end of things. In other words, people are focusing on the things that they're aware of in terms of social inequities. When you look at these things from the neuroscience end, maybe you would have a different set of questions. And so I think it's interesting to bring these into dialogue. This is the list that is sometimes used by the Public Health Agency of Canada. So this is their crude list, rough list of saying, here's some domains. And clearly any one of these things, most of them are just very big categories. Childhood experiences. What does that mean? I mean, so you have, adverse childhood experiences, and you have people trying to measure these and trying to see whether they're additive or whether they're multiplicative, or how you can best characterize these and so on. So each of them poses plenty of conceptual issues and measurement issues and so on. And again, racism, culture, gender, these are all gigantic categories. And moreover, when you try to list things like this, you immediately do this strange thing of sort of disentangling what is in fact a system in which things only have meaning vis-a-vis each other, and treat them as though they're discrete variables. So gender and culture are very closely related. Gender roles are defined by culture. The tolerance of the range, we're currently going through profound, maybe profound, I don't know, anyway, some kind of culture change around the fluidity of gender roles and assignments and options for people. We'll see what the health effects of that are for people. So any one of these things can only be defined in relation to other. In fact, culture is what I think runs through all these. Even to talk about poverty is very much related to cultural values in terms of, well, what is it to be a person of, to live a dignified life, or to be a person of status or esteem? Do you need a lot of things or not? And if it's a lot, what kind of things do you need? Do you need anyway. Okay, I won't belabor it. Everybody here is on the same page. So, but what I will say is it poses challenges if you want to say, well, here's a framework to work on these things, because you can see they got it down to 12 by using gigantic categories. If you start specifying these, you're going to get into the hundreds without even trying very hard, I think. And then you're going to discover that some of the things once you get down a little more granularly to the point you can measure them, you may discover they don't actually travel that well across cultures, that they have to be changed when you move them from one place to the other. So we have racial categories in the US, in the UK, to some degree in Canada, at least that we acknowledge, but they look quite different because of different patterns of migration and different ways that identity have been carved out and so on. The fundamental issue for people might be not a racialized category, but how much that category results in certain kinds of disadvantage. So maybe we need to be measuring that, but we have to, in other words, we have to unpack each of these things and decide how is it relevant to what we're talking about. So this is one of the challenges. Now, why is it important? Well, we've already said, I mean, it's terribly important. There is huge inequalities in every one of the things we might look at. This is recent data on income inequality. And you can see Canada is far from the worst, but it's also not the best. And we have significant income inequality. And this is also a bit of a misleading way of doing it, because if you took a subset, this is overall the whole country, if you took a subset, if you talk about Indigenous people and so on, you would find huge disparities. So here's looking at data on, and it's pretty tiny, you may not be able to see let me make myself less invisible. I was getting a bit invisible there. This is, let me just see, it's so small that I can't read my own slide now. Here we go. Okay. So this is looking at infant mortality, and it's looking at Indigenous people, but comparing them in two different contexts. Areas where there is a large concentration of Indigenous people, which basically means Indigenous communities in rural and remote areas, and areas where there's not a large concentration, so that's mainly urban people or people in near urban settings. And what you can see, there is in fact overall a big difference, and you can see there's a big difference even in those two geographic settings. The first one is for infant mortality, and the second one for suicide mortality. So both very important health outcomes. Here's a couple of slides not on health outcomes per se, but on social determinants, and for people of color. Here just described as black and white, and it's really self-identified. And you can see here that people who are labeled black are much more likely to have an occupational mismatch in the sense of being usually underemployed or misemployed in terms of what they were trained to do, what they're skilled to do. People who have a PhD and are driving a taxi. I mean, this is a common dilemma, not just for people of color, but for newcomers to society as well. So anyway, there's one kind of inequity in society that we know has health consequences. We know, in fact, for migrants that underemployment is a major determinant of mental health. And I mean, not unemployment, but being the person with the PhD or the engineer or whatever, who the only job you can get is driving a taxi or some other work that is not commensurate with what you trained for and what you were doing before you migrate. We know that that's a very powerful determinant of depression, anxiety, other kinds of mental health problems. Here's another of those kinds of indicators now of the working poor. And again, the basic lesson is, and this comes back to my point earlier, that these social determinants are not independent of each other, that poverty is racialized in Canada, certainly in the US and so on. So if we want to understand these factors, we have to consider them in some kind of interactional and intersectional way. And the larger issue comes back to this sort of ecological view. And one way this has been talked about recently at a population level in anthropology and in public health and is what Meryl Singer has called syndemics. The idea that endemic and epidemic problems don't occur in isolation to each other. who is most affected by COVID is also people who are marginalized in other ways in society, who are newcomers, who are living in crowded housing, who are working low paying jobs in hospitals and other settings, because that's the caretakers and people doing the basic infrastructure support are often new waves of migrants who take those jobs that others are not applying for. So that is an important issue in terms of how we study these things. Should they be studied as separate factors, or do we have to think in more systemic terms? Okay, so now I just want to rehearse very briefly the kinds of frameworks, because frameworks are usually at this very broad level. And part of our challenge is we've sort of gotten the message from the people we're working with, the researchers, that these broad perspectives are not that helpful to them, that they need it to be brought down to the level of measures and operationalized concepts and so on that they can actually incorporate into studies and experiments. And I think, I don't know how much we can do that, but we're going to try to at least go some steps in that direction. So these are some of the common frameworks that are in play. And these all come from, have I started them yet? Well, I'm going to show you in a second, actually. Let me skip ahead. In fact, I'll show it to you this way. So there's this interesting review done. There's a Canadian Council for Social Determinants of Health. And in 2015, they published this compendium in which they reviewed 36 different frameworks developed in different countries, different places of social determinants of health. And they picked 6 or 7 of them to highlight as ones that were widely endorsed in some use and so on, and then talk a little bit about their strengths and their differences. So this is just, first of all, one of the points they make is that these frameworks function in different ways. So some frameworks are explanatory frameworks. That is a bit the way that I've been talking about things. They're trying to build up a model of how things are interconnected. Actually, I'll go back and show you a slide. So here's a kind of explanatory framework that's saying, okay, we've got different kinds of factors, and they're connected in different ways, right? You're in a certain environment, it's going to affect how you think and what you get exposed to and what your opportunities are. And we can literally trace very specific things around. We could take the example of food or obesity, and people have done this, and we can start tracing, okay, this is how this factor adds to this one, and so on and so forth. And now we have a model, and we can then put the brain research in that context. We can literally say, well, we know if you have these cues, or you had this experience, or this is the kind of food you're eating, it's going to affect your regulation of appetite and of and so on, weight and so on, in the following ways. And we can then think about the whole thing as an interacting system. And this is a general problem, I should say, in public health and in mental health health promotion, which is that many people realize that we're dealing with complex systems, in the sense that we have many different variables that interact in ways that can sometimes be very sensitive to certain parameters, which again leads to complexity, leads potentially to this extremely complex behavior that's hard to predict, except by running the system that I talked about earlier. Anyway, there's a sort of a causal kind of modeling approach where we're trying to come up with an explanation. Another way in which these frameworks are developed is that they're specifically meant to show interactions, because we're trying to say, what if we did so and so, what would change? So they're trying to model that. And the final orientation is very much action oriented. That is to say, we're trying to distill this down and emphasize those things that are actionable. So the emphasis might be not just on how are things connected and what's a powerful determinant, but which of the determinants could actually change? What can government do? What can people do in their lives, and so on? So that's a different orientation. And each of those different perspectives, and probably other factors as well, lead to different frameworks. And so here's the first framework that they put in this document, which is the fact that it's first probably also speaks to our current politics, because it's an Indigenous framework. So they're beginning by sort of acknowledging the efforts that have gone on in the Indigenous community, notably by the Thunderbird Foundation, are now being carried forward by them. They have a more detailed picture of this that can be used both for health evaluation and determining flourishing and so on. But this is an attempt then to map social determinants of health. And you can see at the center, you have the colors that correspond to a version of the medicine wheel, which is a kind of iconic image of certain aspects of Indigenous knowledge that have to do with balancing different facets of human experience. So this is one model. I'm not going to belabor these right now. I think And one thing that's interesting is documented is they try to say a few things in each case about the characteristics of this. I think if you wanted to do a close analysis of these things, there would be a very interesting story to tell in each case, a kind of sociology of knowledge story about who developed this, under what, at what moment in time, under what circumstances, for what ends. And I will say that none of these, as far as I know, were developed to guide neuroscience research. So if we want to say we want to do the same kind of work, but we want a version of this that's going to be maximally useful at this current moment of our neuroscience research, we'd have to say, well, it's going to take some tweaking, even if there are elements in these things, it's going to take some rethinking to make it fit and be useful for people. Not only to bring it all the way down to here's the measures or here's the practical things that can be done in current paradigms, but even the relationship between things, the way we would think about those might look a little bit different. All these are still relevant, though, and certainly it's of interest already to see what does one of the groups that represents 4 to 5% of the Canadian population that has some of the most dramatic health disparities in Canadian society, what do they see as the important dimensions that should be talked about? And in fact, I can say for them, often notions of community, of family and community and interconnectedness are understood as primary to a person's well-being. Notions of connectedness to the environment are understood as primary to human well-being. And often notions of spirituality in some way, that is a larger meaning framed in some way, are viewed as pretty central. All three, well, community, I'd say, often appears in relationships, but certainly connection to the environment, not as an exploitable resource, but as actually like a living, breathing thing with which one can have relationships, are not usually the conventional way that Euro-Canadian, urban-dwelling Euro-Canadians would tend to think about things. And similarly for spirituality, it tends to be, partly because of the whole legacy of sort of psychology and psychiatry as secular institutions, although there is a tradition now of trying to understand the importance of spirituality in people's lives, that tends to get pushed to one side somewhat in looking for resources and frameworks that people use. Here's another framework. Again, I'm going to go through these quickly because I want to have time to discuss things with you. So I won't belabor it now. In fact, I'll just say, look, it's there. They're interesting to look at. They were developed for different purposes. They're all pretty complicated. And even then, we know that they're incredibly simplified compared to what they're trying to describe. And they're oriented toward different questions. So this is one in the end adopted by the WHO that has a very detailed kind of model of causal effects on the bottom, and on the top and the bottom is more about actionable areas. What can we do? And that can also be taken a step further. I think I'll show you that in a moment. I think I have something later. I'll show you something later where you can begin to unpack the causal model and ask, where in this causal chain could we intervene? And that's the kind of thinking we could try to do with a neuroscience example, where we say, okay, we know something now about how loneliness or social isolation affects people. What are the implications for a detailed model of where we could intervene, if any? So I'm just going to go through all these right now. It would take plenty of time to talk about each of these. In each case, they label it, whether it's predominantly explanatory or whatever, and then go through it. And then this is the Mandela of health. So, okay. Now, okay, so I come to my last few slides, which is really what I want to talk about with you. And again, I'll be very interested to hear your reflections and helps in refining this further. So I've already mentioned that one of the fundamental problems, which is that for neuroscience research in this area, which is if we can show correlations between, do social epidemiological research and show here's a correlation between poverty and heart disease, or here's a correlation between loneliness and mental health problems. Do we need neuroscience to act on that? Maybe we're done. We can now say, fine, let's figure out how to change the social determinant. If we think, oh, we really want to do neuroscience on that, partly because we're fascinated, but partly because we think it's going to tell us something more, the question is, what more is it going to tell us? So here's some attempts to say what more it could tell us. One issue is a general problem we have in all kinds of health research is that when we're working when we're working with self-reports, when we're working with people's stories, we're working with their own self-understanding. And that self-understanding is very important, but of course is always imperfect because we all have limited understanding. I mean, I'm always reminded of this story of there's a wonderful film, what's it called now, 63 Up or whatever, the latest version. It was 40 9 up and 52 up, and it's been all anyway. Basically, Michael Apt had interviewed a cohort of children in the UK starting when they were 7 years old, and came back every 7 years and interviewed them again. And some are kids from lower class, and some are from wealthy class, and so on. And he follows their life trajectories. It's a completely fascinating, compelling movie, and it speaks to the interplay between individual differences in biology and social determinants. And there's one point where he's interviewing these young women in their early 20s who are all from working class background. They were a little cluster of friends of these few women. And he asked them, so how does it feel to be a working class girl or working class woman? And they look at him because they don't know what he's talking about. Because to talk about a working class person is already to adopt the kind of class sociological framework for thinking. This is just not how they think about themselves in everyday life. So that's what I mean by saying we all have an imperfect picture of where we are in the social world and what our biology is. All these things are imperfect. So if we give an account of what's troubling us or what we think is important, it's very important, that account, and it may well reveal things that researchers were not thinking of, but we should definitely not take it as the last word or the only thing worth knowing. So we have a problem. We need to, and if somebody says, I'm feeling fine, I'm feeling great. My father is 93 years old. He's got a number of health problems, but if you ask him how he's feeling, he usually says, I'm feeling fine. So that's an important fact about his way of coping with problems that would make me, complain. But it is not a complete picture of his health. So we need things that go beyond self-report. And there's the potential when we get biological markers, when we have ways of showing, oh, this is what's happening when somebody's experiencing a certain level of pain. And now we know it's so reliable that even if somebody tells us they're not feeling pain and we see this reaction, something's going on. In fact, Richard Lazarus did a crude version of this years ago using galvanic skin response. And he showed that people who were watching these really distressing films and said it was not bothering them, but still had this big emotional response, physiologically, were a different group of people who said, who had a different kind of stress experience. Anyway, okay, so we can get these non-reactive or less reactive self-report measures. We could identify causal factors that we're not aware of entirely, things that people are not aware of that are affecting them. We can control for confounders. So we discover, look, there's individual variation here that affects, just the example I just gave you, how much do people report how much distress they're in? If some people just don't tend to report it, maybe we should be taking that into account, because maybe, in fact, they are experiencing negative effects of an environment, they're just not reporting it. So we could be able to control for individual variation in certain ways. We could discover things that modulate why some things affect people. So we now know, work of Caspi and other people, that certain kinds of adverse childhood environments interact with the kind of temperament that a child has. Some children do okay in a strict environment and don't do well in a very free and permissive environment, and vice versa. So rather than just saying this is the optimal environment, there's some kind of interaction. We need to be able to characterize that. So that's another thing we can do. We can understand the mediators that actually lead to. So how does racism lead to high blood pressure? We want to know all the steps along the way. Maybe we can intervene at different steps along the way. Whether that's going to lead to a pill for racism, or a pill for the consequences of racism. Do we want a pill for the consequences of racism, or do we want a pill for the perpetrators of racism to make people maybe less obnoxious? There's problems with analyzing a process like that at that level as though that's sufficient, but it may still lead us to say, well, here's a way we can mitigate something that people have to deal with in some ways that would help them. And finally, we're hoping that what lies behind discovering mediators is that we're actually understanding a mediating mechanism. And the better we understand the mechanism, the more we can do a lot of things, the more we can generalize, because we can say, well, wherever that mechanism is operating, other things being equal, we know we can say something about what might happen. We've sort of learned, by getting down to that level, we've learned some generalizable knowledge. So this, for me, is one of the things that we want to clarify in this project is, what is it that neuroscience could get us in addition to what we already know? And then if we can characterize that clearly enough, then we're in a position to say at some point when someone announces a new thing, well, which of the things does it fall into? Does it really give us anything new or not? And if so, what exactly new is it giving us? I've just given you some examples. I'm not going to belabor this. I think we'll have other sessions later on as far as I have to work on this project for the next year or so. We'll come back, and these are all areas where there's interesting neuroscience work going on. And we can come back and talk about each of them and ask, okay, so here's the current state of knowledge in neuroscience. Does it add anything? We already know these are all important for people's health. And we have some ideas already of what are some of the social parameters that make a difference. Is the neuroscience just another way of saying the same thing that just happens to impress people because, oh, now we have a high-tech way of showing the same thing has an effect? Or is it, what is it adding? What exactly is it adding? And I think by getting down to concrete examples, we can begin to answer some of my questions that I just posed, and we can also decide, is that the right categorization? What's the right way of describing the different ways that neuroscience could make a difference? So that, again, people who are Renata working with Médecins Sans Frontières and wanting to say, okay, I need something to make sense of some of the impact of poverty I'm seeing or the impact of trauma. How does this new piece of information really change how I'm looking at people, or does it? I mean, and then I'm almost finished. So yeah, so this is one way of starting to think about it. This is from the earlier work that WHO drew from by this researcher, Dietrichson, where the sort of some of the broad causal lines are drawn, and then the thought is, where could one intervene? One can intervene at the level of people's social position, or at the kind of things they're exposed to, or at the kinds of actual injuries that are occurring for people, and so on. So each of these have somewhat different implications. Trying to think it through at that level, if you're talking about making a social change, that's in a sense what you have to do. You can do it just at the immediate, what comes to mind right away, because we know there's a problem over there, but you can also try to do it more systematically, and maybe the neuroscience helps us hone in on certain areas where we think, well, we would get a lot of impact if we could do it at that level. Okay. I'm not going to belabor it. We have these are just examples of interventions I won't talk about. So what are the challenges? My last, second to last substantive slide. Not quite. The challenges in neuroscience addressing social determinants of health include the following. First of all, in terms of human research, well, the biggest problem representatively is if you're just studying animals, you're leaving out some of the important things. Some, we have analogies. There's some things. Animals also, some are social animals and they need environments. Most mouse research and rat research is done on animals that are already in extremely unhealthy, unnatural social environments, right? They're already being kept in an environment that is not at all what they were evolutionarily evolved to live in. So we're already studying animals that are unhealthy from a social point of view, probably. And so that's already a skewing in all that research. But in any event, there are also things I already mentioned. There's no animal model of the stress of migration, or of transracial adoption, or of, losing your job and being told, being underemployed in a new job. And I mean, you can find analogies, but they're pretty weak analogies in the end. So there's a whole bunch of, but then there are issues just of representativeness in terms of when you do human studies, who is in the sample? Does it represent the general population? Or is it, undergraduate students who all are white middle-class kids or something, or other ways that research gets done with who's convenient to include in research? Usually these social determinants are not being measured. Very few of them are being measured, so we don't know key ones, or we don't know how they might interact with other ones. They're not being conceptualized that way. And usually the paradigms that are being used are not very ecologically valid. I'll say a word about that in a second. And overall, if you want to put all these together, we could say what's missing is more contextual, ecologically valid thinking about how things are embedded in systems. So here's a recent paper that just talks about neuroscience research and the idea that you have in experimental research a huge range from extremely artificial, stripped down, show people a few dots in a screen inside the scanner, to people in the real world interacting in a normal situation and then getting some kind of a parameter measured and looked at. So that would be kind of the range. So even in experimental research, you have a huge range from very artificial and raising questions about how well it generalizes to a much smaller amount of work, because it's technically, again, much more difficult and maybe sometimes limited in what people can do, but that is much more real world. So that's one sort of set of issues. So it brings me to my last comments, which is around how to go forward. Part of the work I think I've already tried to mention, which is, I think, is this conceptual work, which is the bottom part of the slide, how to think about the brain in a more ecological way. The most basic part is to engage with different stakeholders. Some of you here are, in effect, stakeholders. You're clinicians, or you work with certain populations, and who let you know what the issues are from their point of view, and you can, to some degree, speak on their behalf or make sure they come to the table and their voices are heard. So that's an issue. How do we get stakeholder engagement to guide neuroscience research and to guide the questions it asks and the kind of things it measures? How do we get representative sampling so that just in terms of Canada, let's say, because we're trying to do something for Canada, what are the salient dimensions of the population in Canada, so that we need not just because a representative sample for this kind of research doesn't just mean, okay, let's make sure we have 1% of this and 2% of this. It means oversampling those groups where we think there's something important going on, so we can figure out what's going on. It won't do to say 4% of our sample were Indigenous and we found the overall thing was so-and-so, because that 4% result will be buried in the larger sample. It may have no effect on the results, so you may not get the answer you need. So we have to decide again, doing representative sampling is not simply, it's not like voting, let's say everybody gets one vote. It's deciding which are the salient dimensions of the population where we have to oversample so we can learn about that dimension, so we can then put it back in when we're asking questions about equity. So that's a complicated issue. And then, as I say, the last issue here is how to conceive of the brain as something that doesn't exist in isolation, in this constant developmental transaction. So the way we're doing this now in this process is we have a series of small work groups who are producing position papers on these kinds of issues. These are the topics we have currently people working on. And then we plan to bring these people together to talk to each other, to try to talk about, are there common issues? Is it really one big thing we can have that will address all these things? If we, one approach we can have that can be tailored for these different dimensions, or do different areas really raise other, whole other set of issues that just didn't occur in one area when we're thinking about one kind of problem? If we're thinking about developmental disabilities, is that very different than looking at end-of-life problems for people? Or is it, if we're looking at whatever, yeah. So this list is not comprehensive or complete. It partly represents some priorities we have, but it also represents who in our little local community is keen to work on certain things, and in fact has already worked on certain things, so they're ready to prepare without too much time and effort, at least a kind of beginning discussion paper, just a few pages long, that will start this process. So that's what I'm engaged in with many other people. I haven't listed their names here. If any of you are interested, those of you in our community and so on, let me know, and we can put you in touch with those people. And this is the, with everything up to the last thing here is really about the more scientific conceptual end. But in parallel, we have a process going on of trying to set up a stakeholder advisory group, who will be people in the policy milieu and in practice milieus and so on, who can articulate what they think the priorities are, and then put these things together so that we can present these more concept-driven, science-driven sort of discussions of particular aspects of social determinants of health and neuroscience, and get their feedback as to whether that really matches up with what they see as the priorities, what's missing, what else needs to be done. This is an example of something like that process that was done at McGill by Angela Felipe and Lucy Locke around developmental disabilities, neurodevelopmental disabilities, where they looked at different social determinants of health frameworks, but then they had an engagement process with many different stakeholder groups to produce a kind of framework about how knowledge could circulate and be exchanged between people with lived experience and everyday practical concerns, and the researchers who are trying to generate knowledge or trying to show how to apply their knowledge. So that's where we're heading. This is a model of the kind of thing, again, one scheme we might end up with. The point is not to just have a beautiful diagram, but to literally have a set of, here's the kind of meeting that can be held, here's a kind of web portal where certain kind of information can be presented in a way that people can make use of, here's a link to make between different communities so there's communication going on, those kinds of very practical things, as well as the tools for researchers. So that's the end of my presentation. Of course, it turned into a presentation and turned into me rattling on. We have a few minutes here for discussion, reflections. I'm really hoping for everybody's input. And so I would say, even if you don't do it now, please go ahead and send me any thoughts or suggestions.